All right, folks, I reckon that's us live there, ready to go now. Hello, welcome. My name is Matthew. I am the fortunate soul who gets to sit down and talk the ear off, well, probably listen the ear off more like it, to the wonderful playwright, son of the Cathedral Quarter. You know, what other great things can we say about you, Martin? You know, absolute legendary status, long career, long line of plays, all these other excellent things. But we're just going to jump straight into the chat. Thanks so much for being here. You know, really excited to be part of the Out to Lunch Festival. And Martin is someone who I've been really excited to talk to and hear more of his story from a long time. I often, in the old times, whenever we could go to pubs and places, I would meet with people and we'd sit around the fire and I'd be like, who should I talk to next? Who is interested in Belfast? And Martin's name kept coming up. So it's not exactly the fireside chat that we had imagined or planned, Martin, but I am really excited for you to be here, and I appreciate you bringing your fire as well. So to kind of kick us off, I think maybe someone needs to unmute Martin, but to kick us off, Martin, I'd love to kind of start way back in the beginning, as it were, and I love to kind of start all interviews in the same place, and it's very simply this. What's your first memory, man? Or tell us about a really early experience that you can remember from your time as a boy.
Yeah, I grew up in Moffat Street in the Docks area, a one up, one down. I heard Michael Caine talking one time on TV saying he grew up in poverty, but in a two up, two down. I says, you're a lucky bastard. We'd one up, one. And there was like 12 of us all in the one house. I'd like to ask my dad now if he was still alive, what was he playing at? But my earliest memory is putting my hand up to the table, which was in front of the window leading to the street, and to get a bit of Belfast bop. I think that's my earliest memory.
Wow. So 12 in the one house. What was that like?
Fantastic. Well, there was 8 slept in my bed.
Flip me.
And if you wanted to turn, somebody shouted, right, everybody turn to the right. And we all turned to the right. And as our Brian always says, my brother, he says he learned to swim at the shallow end. So having, also the toilet seat, an outside toilet, and you'd think that was a bad memory, but there'd always someone had been there before you. Even in the winter, it was always warm.
That's great. There has to be some perks.
Has to be. There's a great advantages of a large family. Great advantages, and I mean that, of the comradeship and stuff like that.
And I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, your family wasn't unique in the neighborhood, and there being so many.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There was the Jellinses up the street, of which there's about 10. Kelly's across the street, about 7 or 8. The Brady's in Henry Street had about 24. And of course, the old myth that we were the mixed district, Catholic and Protestant. I grew up in a Catholic background. The old myth that Protestants didn't have big families. There was 19 in the Doak's house, and so right across the board, working class people just didn't have a handle on controlling their willies and their lives.
So talk to me a bit more about the neighborhood, because that whole part of the city has changed tremendously, and it keeps changing very, very dramatically. And as someone, I'll embarrass myself here, I was born in '95, so the Belfast I know is very different to the Belfast you've lived through. You just hear stories, and to me, all it is stories. You hear, that part of the city, like you've already mentioned, was incredibly diverse, not just Protestant and Catholics, but lots of people that were connected to the ship industry. You hear stories of fellas walking pet lions down the street. You hear all sorts of stuff. So, what was the neighborhood like, even historically, and the neighborhood you experienced?
Well, York Street pretty much started in Belfast city centre. Okay. It started where the Belfast Telegraph offices were, just there at Royal Avenue. The continuation of that is York Street, where the Art College is now, where the new college is. And that went right out to the shore, as it were, right along to York Road, which went right down past Crusaders Football Club. So if you start in the city centre area, it was a mix of wee villages. The first one on the right-hand side, coming from Royal Avenue, was the Half Bop. And that's where Cathedral Quarter is now, where the Mac is, and all that stuff. You had Edward Street and those other wee streets. Then, staying on the right-hand side, you had Little, which was the bottom of Great Patrick Street, Garmoyle Street, Tomb Street, and that was full of Italian. Not when I was growing up, it was only a few Italian families left, but that's where the Italians came at the turn of the last century and lived there in droves, and then spread around the city and further afield. Antoinette Morelli, the actor, is from that part of the world, and so on. Then if you cross the road again, you're in the Art District, which was the Barrack Wall. Named so because of our British Army's artillery barracks, built in 1848 or something like that.
Wow.
And it had a big surround of a big high natural stone wall, which ran right along the length of a good part of North Queen Street. Then back over to the other side of York Street again, you're into Sailortown. And that sort of like started from Nelson Street, the Half Bop, right down to the docks, right down to the water. Then you cross over again and you're in Taggart's Bay, where the writer Sam Goldwyn came from. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he wrote short stories and a few novels. So all those wee villages, and the whole Catholic and Protestant thing was weird, because in the Barrack Wall, for instance, the Catholics were more towards the top end of the street. The top
Okay.
end, maybe about 6 streets. Top end was Catholic, and at the bottom end were Protestants.
Right.
And by and large, apart, there was a couple of big, the 1935 riots, sectarian riots, were actually fought in York Street in our district. And the War of Independence, or the creation of the state, 1921-22, again, York Street carried the brunt of all the violence. In fact, my grandfather, Charlie Harvey, was shot dead by a Protestant sniper.
Wow.
As he walked through all the yard walls had a hole in them, cut so people could go down the street. And when he was walking through that and came out the other end at Union Place, he was shot and died in 1922.
So what sort of stuff would you have seen as a boy? You know, because I imagine you just didn't stay all day cooped up around an Xbox and the one up, one down. I imagine you were out traveling about, exploring. You know, what sort of things do you remember about that?
Well, the main thing was the football street, which was North Hill Street, which ran at the top of all our streets. And we paid, like, you went to 10 o'clock mass when you did go to mass, and when you were a Catholic. You went to 10 o'clock mass, got out about 11:15, and then we picked teams, 2 teams of however many was there, 20 a side or whatever. Using the lampposts as goalposts, you played till about 10 or 10:30 that night when it was dark. You went home for your dinner, got your dinner, and came back out, and the match was still on. You know.
And what sort of dinner was Mum putting on the table?
It would have been a bit of chicken and potatoes and some vegetables, with always, believe it or not, a bit of jelly and custard for dessert.
Nice one.
So that
Very
would have
nice.
been it. When we went, we all had dogs, right? So I had a dog called Rocky. The Joneses had a Nile mutt that was half alive and half dead, called Shamrock.
Lucky.
Rebel. We had about 8 dogs, and we used to go up the Newsboys Club, which I went to, which was a big part of my childhood in York Street, where I played football and boxed and table tennis and Scottish dancing. Would you believe?
Wow.
They had a cottage along the Lagan across the river from the village of Eden Dairy. And so you went there at the weekends. So you had all these ruffians from York Street had to go up in the Malone Road bus and then walk through Barnett's Park, top of Malone, and along the Lagan to Dixon's Cottage. So when we weren't going there with the Newsboys, we would have went up there ourselves with the dogs. And our dogs were streetways and fought, and they'd have been eating poodles and sausage dogs and stuff like that to the horror of their owners.
Crazy.
On the other end of North Belfast, we went to Alexander Park, the Grove, and then the Cave Hill. Spent a lot in the Cave Hill.
Wow. How long would it have taken you to get there from your house?
Oh, well, you got the bus, and it left you off at the bottom of the zoo steps. And there used to be steps up.
Oh, wow.
So you get off there, and then you just ran free up the Cave Hill. And sometimes on the way down, broke into the zoo from the railings and did a tour of the zoo. So,
that's unbelievable. So, I mean, what was your first job? Do you remember?
Yes, my first job. I left school at 15. In fact, I left school around my 14th birthday because I was to leave. My birthday's on the 22nd of November, and I was to leave that Christmas, leave in December. And after my birthday, I just said, "Fuck it," I didn't go back to school. So my first job was at Noble's bag store, as we called it, bag store. Right. And that was a big yard in the half bop where they cleansed old fish bags and fish bags from the docks and resold them. It was the dirtiest, filthiest thing.
Flip me.
Then I went to work with McHugh Dick's timber yard down the docks down Duncrew Street, and pulling wood off a machinist at the other end and stacking it. And then I got somebody said to me, I went to the Youth Employment Service, which there was at that time, and I got coaxed or diverted into cloth cutting. And I became a cloth cutter for 4 or 5 years. I served my time in Pottinger's Entry. And
yeah, wow.
A wee doorway there just beside.
There's always a fella busking underneath it usually because of the echo.
Well, our doorway was next to that, in between it and the bar. What's the bar? The Morning Star.
That's right.
And you went right up to the top where our factory was, making jeans and boiler suits and things like that. And I did that for 4 or 5 years.
So how does a teen or a mid-20 guy then stumble into theater? I'm going to make an assumption. Like I don't know. Like maybe it was common, but like were loads of people around you going to the theater or into writing or into the arts, or was it looked on as what are you doing that for?
The only theatre I knew up until I was 26 was the Mother Hospital's operating theatre, where my dad had an operation for piles. Nobody around our way went to the theatre. Nobody was an actor. Nobody was an artist. Nobody was anything. It was completely Philistine in that sense. There was obviously people who played music. There was guys who were in bands, and Tucker Kelly across the street from us was on 6-5 Special, Top of the Pops of the Day, 1960-61, singing, So there was a lot of music or musicians about the place, but the theatre, no. First time I ever heard of the theatre was our aunt came back probably about 1970 or 71, came back after seeing James Young.
Oh, wow.
You ever heard of James Young?
Yeah.
He's an early actor and comedian who did one-man shows in the group theatre. And she would have said, we laughed all night. That was the first time I ever heard of the notion of theatre. What happened then was that by the time I was 20, the Troubles had broken out. And we had moved in the meantime to Turf Lodge, sunny Turf Lodge on the hills of the Black Mountain, on the side of the Black Mountain. And the Troubles, the first weekend of August 1969 was the biggest shock of my life. And it was for loads of people. I was 18, and suddenly whole districts were getting burned, people shot. And that one weekend, there was 6 people dead.
Flip me.
And that might seem like nothing now, but at that time, remember, at the weekends, I was going to the dance halls, and I thought I was Stevie Marriott out of Small Faces, or Mick Pender out of Searchers, and I was walking away with Leaving Girls Home all over Belfast. And then suddenly this life, remember, this is just the end of the 60s, this life was turned upside down. There was buses across the road on fire, buses that used to sit on to go up the road. And that was just exhilarating and extraordinary. And at the start, I loved it. Anything that broke the routine and looked like it would be good fun, I thought was fantastic.
Yeah.
So that during that, then I didn't know at that time, but my 2 brothers were already in the Republican movement and had been since the mid to late 60s. Because in those days, the IRA was a secretive organization and very, very, very small. And but in 1969, after the first outbreak, they couldn't cope with the recruits. People went flying into the IRA. And I applied to join the IRA with my other younger brother. And I went to a couple of classes, induction classes, and I dropped out because I didn't like the notion of violence. I didn't want to. I was streetwise in the sense that I grew up in York Street and I could fight or defend myself.
Yeah.
The notion of a gun, which was so definitive and probably final, I dropped out. But then it just got worse and worse. Within a few months, the false curfew came. I don't know if you know of all this stuff, Matthew, but they were pretty heavy duty, violent communal upheavals. And then internment came out. Internment came out on August the 9th, 1971, and that was the end of normal life in Belfast. Because even between 1969, when I was when the first violence happened, I was still leaving. I left the girl home to Canberra Street up to Shankill, and she brought me around to her ma's house and then round to an empty house that they'd just bought or were moving. So I was walking around those districts. So some semblance of normal life reoccurred in 70, 71, up until internment week. And internment week just changed everything. There was huge numbers of people on the streets running around, just going buck mad. Our estates just became violent places.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, it never stopped. So I then joined the IRA around 1971, just before internment came out, because I'd been reading, Marxism, Leninism, all the revolutionary writers of the time.
What turned you on to that? How did you get even a hold of that, or what made you check those out?
Well, it was really the Republican movement. Eamon was telling me about a conference he was at where he said the movement's going socialist. And I said, this is during the dark in bed at night. He's in one bed and I'm in the other. And I said, Jesus Christ, the movement's going communist. I better tell my mama. And then I was on the top of a bus going down the Falls Road, and there was a group of people writing things on the wall: housing, not violence; housing, not flats. Because flats had become a big issue, and I said, "That's what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to do. I want to be politically active."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then you discover that in something is what would you call it? Macho as the Republican movement, being simply, I joined the political wing, which was the Republican clubs in those days, and I was active, but other people in the IRA didn't take me seriously when I wanted something done. If I wanted a campaign against the get old age pension or something in Turf Lodge,
Mm-hmm.
I was just dismissed.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when you read Lenin and what is to be done, his famous book, his view was that you need to be armed.
Mm-hmm.
You need to take power and take control.
Mm-hmm.
And around that time, that's what I decided to do, and I joined the official IRA, which was different because there was a split at that time.
Yeah. So at what point did your interest in words come about? I might seem like an odd thing to say, but just whenever you're talking about even seeing the stuff written on the walls, we all see that stuff. Some of us take note of it, some of us don't. Did you always have that kind of bend towards the written word? I imagine not everyone's in their bunk at night in the dark reading Marxism, where did that come from?
Before all of that, before I was going down to Gardner's and standing in Gardner's bookshop and reading a quarter of what is to be done over 2 hours standing in the bookshop. I had no money to buy books. I ended up starting to steal a lot of books in those days for my education. Other kids were at Queen's or somewhere else. I was in Gardner's bookshop, stealing books. But here's what is the great thing. At this point I need to talk about my father. My father was a dock labourer who didn't want to work. So we didn't get a great upbringing. He didn't work that much, but he read, and he was very knowledgeable, and he read, and he read, and he read, and told stories late at night. He was a great master storyteller, as a lot of dockers are, because of always starting in from the rain or no work. So they gather together and they tell stories. And you learn things like a story has to have a start, has to have a middle, and then there has to be a punchline. Any docker can do that to this day, the older one. Whereas you still get a lot of people telling stories who don't know that frame and can't do it. But my father was a master storyteller, and he'd get up in the middle of the floor and he'd act out different people around our way. Now, this man's a docker, he's 6'2", built like, you know, Sonny Liston or Frank Bruno, big man, and I'm going to write a play about him because his essential issue was that he was writing poetry and getting it published in the odd magazine.
Wow.
And he was reading poetry. Like you'd go to his bedside and there'd be Yeats or Patrick Colum or maybe Wordsworth. Now in our whole district, that wasn't going on.
Wow.
I knew very quickly that my dad was the only one doing that. There used to be a thing about lending books in those days, Matthew, where about 10 o'clock at night, you'd fold 3 books together by the leaves, you know, and attach them all to each other. He says, now, Owen, get me some books. Go up to Mr. Cabinet and then go to Robbie Baker or go to this one. And then I'm at the door and he'd say, and no cowboy books. Because a lot of the men in those days in the 40s and 50s and 60s read these cowboy books, which were thin, mostly photographs.
Yeah.
Or a lot of photographs or drawings. And of course, my dad wanted something substantial to read. Mm-hmm. Like I remember him taking me down to Central Library, which was very close to us. And I'm holding his hand and I could hear him tutting and muttering. There was no books that he could read.
Wow.
Because all the ones in the sections he was interested in were the same, and he'd read them all, and he was waiting on the new intake.
That's great.
So a ferocious reader and a great storyteller. So I found myself, Matthew, when I was 16, 17, starting to write poetry. Not because, I mean, I didn't even think of my father that he had written poetry in the 50s and stuff like that. I was just, I don't know where it came from. I just started doing it. When I went to the Orpheus ballroom and you left the girl home and then you arranged to meet outside the GPO, which is where Castle Court is now, that was a favourite meeting place. If she didn't turn up, which sometimes happened, that was 4 poems. You know, when you were depressed or annoyed or down.
Yeah. It's great material getting dumped.
Getting dumped. Yeah, essentially that was it. So I used to read a lot of poetry. Then when I was 17, we were all watching Top of Pops in John McAvoy's house. And I remember, well, it was the Rolling Stones. So that's about, I don't know, 60, 67. Told you once and I told you twice. Mick Jagger was a great showman. And we all looked at each other. And I knew what we were all thinking. We could do that. So we all went downtown, bought guitars and hire purchase.
Unbelievable.
And only 2 of us kept at it. John Napier played a bit and he ended up in folk groups. And I played it then for the rest of my life. So I started writing songs. And I remember in the late 60s, right into the 70s, probably wrote 200 songs.
My goodness.
So that creativity was there at that time.
Yeah. So how did you go about honing that? And I say that kind of with a bit of hesitation because I think there is kind of a big movement where now I think a lot of people my age, myself included, I'm guilty. It's like, okay, I need to do a course on creative writing, or I need to go and do this masterclass, or I need to go and have someone tell me how to do it versus going out and just doing it like you did. So what was there ever a moment where you're like, okay, I need to then start sharpening this, or did you just keep doing the repetitions until it worked?
Matthew, this is mad, and when I think about it, it gets even madder, you know. I saw 2 plays.
Right.
In 1975, I was OC of Turf Lodge. I was also in the battalion staff. And we were told by the office downtown that a play was coming up from Dublin and we had to put it on.
Okay.
And I was given the job of putting it on other centres around Belfast, including Queen's University. And it was a play by John Arden and Margaretta Darcy, who I'd never heard of in my life. I don't know if you know them. And John Arden's one of the angry young men from the Royal Court in the 1950s and 60s who wrote Sergeant Musgrave's Dance and other plays that get done regularly. Margaretta Darcy is a mad Galway woman who brought him to Ireland. So they'd written a play about the life and times of James Connolly, and it was my job to put it on. As I was actually at that time, I was full-time organizer of the Republican clubs on £14 a week.
Wow.
So plus getting £14 on the dole, doing a double, if you might say. And we got it on all the centres. The only problem was it lasted for 18 hours.
Oh.
If you've ever heard of it, the Non-Stop Connolly Show is a great project. So at Queen's, we put it on for 18 hours. You had to bring a pillow and a lunch and all that stuff. But I didn't go to watch it anywhere because I was annoyed to some extent that here we are working for the revolution and the command staff in central Belfast, our headquarters in Dublin, wanted me to organise a play.
Yeah.
Play. That was a bit out of the way. However, so John Arden came up to Belfast and I brought him round to my house and him and my dad sat and talked for 3 or 4 hours. And then the two of them, Arden and Darcy, then walked around Turf Lodge in costume with placards and all. With the other actors, there's about 4 or 5 actors drumming up support for the show that night. So that night it was on in Turf Lodge, and I thought, well, I better fucking be here. So I stood at the bar with the rest of the men, and about 100 people turned up, mainly women and children. And I remember the first lines of the play. John Arden's son was in it, and it was the work was hard, but the work was hard and the pay was poor. I just remember those 2 lines. And he was scrubbing a floor at the time, John Arden's son. So then there was things like he starts telling the story of Connolly, that started off with the Land League and all that stuff. And suddenly there was 5 actors, and instead of being in costume, they just put a coat on or a hat on to become a militia, or another hat on to become a peasant. And that's the way it was. And I'd never seen anything like this before. So suddenly, after standing at the bar talking to the men about other things, I kept getting drawn to the play. And then this guy jumped off the stage and ran through the audience, chased by English yeomen with blunderbuss and letting off these sounds like guns. And the place was electrified. Everybody cheering the bandit, the Land League bandit, against the English yeoman. And I remember the English soldiers are walking about round the door, round outside the front door of the club, coming into it a lot. And that was exhilarating. I didn't really realize it at the time, but I was telling the guy about it the following week in the club called Desi Murray, and he says, "There's a play on the Lyric Theatre you might be interested in. We do it for love." And I says, "Where's the Lyric Theatre?" And he told me where it was. And myself and my wife then, we went to see it, and I loved it as well. But walking down the stairs of the Lyric, I remember saying to myself, back to this stuff again, the Rolling Stones, I can't do that. And I have more to say than what's in that play. And I went home. No, I went down to Gardner's first and stole a big writing pad.
Yeah.
They gave 4 writing pads. And I wrote the first play sitting up in bed over about 6 weeks. And I wrote about the 1932 hunger riots in Belfast, which my dad used to endlessly tell stories about. And because I had a lot of influence in the district, I was able to solicit people or order them into the play. So if I had a character like Jackie Wisdom or John Gibson, instead of me making up a character, I wrote the dialogue and the action around how he would behave.
That's brilliant.
That's probably all he could do. And I was in the play myself. In fact, I think I played the lead part, and that was the last time I ever did anything like that.
Nice.
But we got an audience, and the audiences loved it. And then we did a few more plays that I'd set up and wrote late at night and put them on in the local club, and people were loving them, and I thought, "Fuck, there's something in this, and we'll keep this going." And that's how the whole thing started. I mean, sorry, just one of the things I try and remember all the time is when I was watching the John Arden play, the thought struck me that these people on the stage were able to make me feel angry, excited, laugh, think. Actors were pretending to be other people. They knew, I knew, I knew, they knew, and yet it still worked. And so from those two plays, I wrote my first play. Like that is mad when you think of, people do 10-year courses or writing stuff, and I just actually structured them the same way as we do it for Love and my first play, We Want Work, We Want Bread. I just structured them same as Arden's show and Non-Stop Comedy show. Fast moving songs, action, and it seemed to work.
It's incredible. So talk to me about sitting up in bed writing. Is that something that stuck? Is that a practice that kept going?
Well, not necessarily sitting up in bed, but I'd been used to writing poetry over the years. I had poetry published in the Teens in the City Week magazine, so the writing thing then had taken off from I was 16, 17, and I was wanting to write. What happened then was the Republican Club's Advice Centre in Turf Lodge had a typewriter. So I used the typewriter to write the plays. I took it home at nights and used it. The other thing was I had no money to put on the play. Bernard Cullen lives nearby, and he'd been acting at the Lyric Theatre as an amateur. I think he was in some professional shows. And he says apply to the Arts Council. So I wrote into the Arts Council for money to put on We Want Work, We Want Bread. And I got a letter back from somebody called Michael Longley telling me that we don't put on plays by unknown playwrights. We don't put on unknown plays by unknown playwrights, but get in touch with Marie O'Malley at the Lyric Theatre. Now, of course, Michael Longley has since become a great supporter of mine and proposed me for Aosdána, which I've just got into, and has been fantastic in my career. So I went to Billy McMillan, who was OC of the command staff in Belfast, down the Falls. I says, Billy, I've written a play, I want to put it on, and I need some money for it. He says, what do you need? I says, about £50. This is 1976. He turned around to a woman called Kitty O'Kane who looked after him money, and he says, give him £50.
Unbelievable.
No discussion, no debate. So my first play wasn't funded by the Arts Council. It was funded by the official IRA. And only playwrights have that start.
Oh man, that should be in your bio. That should be your opening line. That's crazy. If there was if the movie trailer version, that would be how they would open it. The shock and horror of
it. Yeah.
Class. So we've talked a few times about how kind of the thread that runs throughout a lot of your work is this desire you have to articulate the working class voice. And that makes sense in the context of what we've already talked about with your upbringing and your own story. But that aside, why is that important to you, or why do you think that needs to be done?
Well, the way I grew up, you know, when you grow up like that and you see everybody in the district struggling, you don't have to be Einstein to work out there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And when I started going to the theatre then in 1976, I then became a bit ferocious in the sense of I would get the black taxi down the Falls Road with my wife, usually, ex-wife at that time, and a bus facing Europa up to the Lyric or the Arts Theatre. And I would try and see every play I possibly could. I wanted to suck all that up. I wanted to be good at this. So I watched as much theatre as possible, which I tell young people today. And the point you were making was what?
Articulating a working class voice. Why is it important?
Yes. So I saw all these plays. You'd have Julius Caesar 1 minute, which is my favorite Shakespeare play, and then maybe Oscar Wilde's a gentle comedy. Then maybe George Bernard Shaw. I've actually mentioned two people who had a socialist perspective, but a lot of the other plays would be plays that I thought amounted to nothing thematically. And I thought, well, I can tell them about my ma. I tell them about Grana. I can tell them about the hunger rats in the 30s. I can tell them about kids growing up in Turf Lodge with nothing. And that was a passion then. That was a passion that I wanted to. That was a wrong that I wanted to right.
Yeah.
And now it didn't always stay like that. Over the years, of course, I thought the first plays that I wrote would be a clarion call to the revolution. That after 5 plays, there'd be a 32 county socialist workers' republic.
Yeah.
5 plays.
Yeah.
And
single-handedly.
Yes. And I soon found out that that's all mad. And so over the years, whilst I still have at the centre the notion of articulating the inarticulate or the unvoiced, I'm not driven by any particular ideology.
Yeah.
And I'm about putting people on the stage, communities on the stage, and that's how it has transpired over the years. Excuse me.
Absolutely. And I guess like in that, you know, you mentioned at the start, you're able to not only just write about the characters you see around you, but you can also then just pull them into the roles. What challenges did you run into then whenever your plays start to be performed elsewhere, and maybe, you know, actors aren't people that you've grown up with, and they aren't aware of the dialect, and they're not sure of certain words or how to say, you know, pronounce things in the way that you would like them to? What was that kind of experience like?
Well, I want to go back just a wee bit to the fellowship. My main problem in the fellowship was drink.
Right.
You know, these people they thought they had to get drunk to go on stage and things like that. So I had to go around chaperone on a lot of that. Now, when I moved to the Lyric, I was then, some of the Lyric people on the board saw my plays in the group theatre, the first Turf Lodge ones, and then they appointed me resident playwright in September 1980. And I was halfway through a play called Dockers. And they said, well, carry on. And I wrote Dockers. And Dockers is probably just about my family life, you know, my father, my grandfather, my brothers. When I mentioned my own work record earlier, that was all permeated by days at the dock. You know, in between employment, I'd spend 2 months at the dock or the summer at the dock, earning, because the dock's was a casual system, and you get employed by the day. So I knew the docks inside out, and I wrote this play. And then big cast, about 10 or 11 in the cast. And the first week of rehearsals, I couldn't hear the Belfast accent in any half accurate way. There was a few who were okay, but quite a number of the actors had spent the last 10, 15, 20 years eradicating maybe if they did have a working class accent. And so all the tenets of working class dialect at that time, like not using the G's at the end of coming, going, being, we say coming, going, being, not saying bright, right, nice, but saying bright, right, nice. Those things weren't there. And I had to call, that might be minor things, but at the time I was also trying to capture the culture of the doc, and that included storytelling. And the storytelling had to be right. Like if a doctor's story finished with a line that says, that's coming through nicely. That was the punchline, I'm fucked.
Yeah.
You know, my reputation or street cred in the docs, that anybody who came to say would say, Lynch had play was a load of shit. So I had to stop the director after the first week, Sam McCready. Sam McCready was probably the biggest influence on me as a writer. And I had to say, Sam, let's get this dialogue right. And we worked on it, and everybody was told they had to get it right. And it did get right. And dockers came to see it in their droves and loved it. Working people came to see it. A lot of the people who were coming to see my previous 5 or 6 plays in Turf Lodge and around the clubs of West Belfast all went to the Lyric for the first time.
Wow.
So this was a brand new audience the Lyric had never had. I mean, large numbers of them. Dockers was sold out and sold out, came back and was sold out again. People shouting up in the middle of the auditorium, people smoking in the auditorium, bringing their drink into the auditorium, breaking all the conventions. And the secretary of the Lyric Theatre at that time, a lovely woman called Winifred Bell, was turning her hair out. And on the opening night, she came to me, Martin, could you get your people to stop smoking? I said, my people? They're not my people. So that's and that was a great night. It was a standing ovation, and I was what you don't get nowadays, or I've never seen it before. I'm not a theatre person, so I don't know the protocol, but I was called up on stage to say a few words, and that was incredible. The atmosphere was just electric. I mean, people have written about this besides me, about the opening night of Dockers, and that, of course, was great encouragement for me to continue. The other thing was that I got £2,000 a year for being writer in residence, which I think was about £84 a week, £81 a week. And I was able to sign off the dole, which I'd been on. I signed off box 32 on the Falls Road to pick up my wages at the Lyric Theatre that Friday. Muriel Molly insisted that I come to the Lyric and stand on the line, collect my wages in an envelope, along with all the actors used to come between, I think, 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock on a Friday at the Lyric to get their weekly wages. And I'd find myself standing in the line with Stella McCusker or Louis Rolson, or people I essentially didn't know hardly, and collect my money and go and buy books for the first time.
Class. Martin, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'd love to kind of end with.
We only got them a first play.
I know, but here that's the we'll need to do about 10 more of these to get through the biography. Zooming out then, right? I do like how we kind of we made it to the open night of Dockers. That's further than I maybe thought we would get, so we did well.
Okay.
Zooming out and looking at everything though, out of everything, along the way, what was the hardest moment, or what was the greatest challenge, and how do you overcome it?
There's probably two greatest or strongest challenges throughout my career. Was one, earning enough money to keep myself afloat as a playwright. I remember in the early well, let me say this. I was on a dole twice. Once in the mid-80s after the Lyric money stopped. Was on a dole for about maybe 6 months. And then in the mid-90s, I was on the dole as well for another 3 or 4 months. Other than that, I have earned some sort of a living as a writer, producer, or in later years, producer and director. So earning a living in the 80s and 90s was very tough because there wasn't money coming in and I had bills to pay and all the rest of it. And I used to run around thinking maybe I should go back to robbing banks or post offices or something like that.
Yeah.
Just to ease things up. The second thing would probably be, and I know people might be annoyed at this, but as I formed a theatre company, so I formed a theatre company in 1990 called Point Fields, maybe a bit earlier than that. And we put on plays by Gary Mitchell and McCafferty, Hugh Murphy, myself, and others. And then in around the early 2000s, I formed a company called Green Shoot Productions. And I felt
that after the John Hugh quote.
Yes.
Yes. Nice. That's one of my favorites by him, actually. Class.
I am the green shoot waiting for or asking for the flower. Actually, Ian McElhenney did a play about Hewitt, and he called it that as well, as far as I remember.
Because there's a slab in Writer's Corner outside St Anne's Cathedral on the ground that has
yes,
I am the green shoot asking for the flower.
Yes, yeah. I put that there.
Did you?
As I created Writer's Square, and yeah, anyway, doesn't matter. The biggest challenge was not getting consistent support and respect from the Arts Council. That would be my biggest challenge from 2000 to this moment till today.
Yeah. How about the greatest success?
Depends what you mean by success.
Whatever way you want to take it.
I've loved the fact that, for instance, with Green Shoot, which is a not-for-profit, that we created at least a couple of plays that will be getting done here in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Chronicles of Law and Cash, Two Sore Legs by Brenda Murphy. Both of them did the Edinburgh Festival and did brilliant. And even just to get two shows like that, there's probably one or two others, but to get two shows like that I think will stand the test of time, because a lot of theatre companies come and go and they never achieve that.
Yeah.
The other big successes would be the commercial successes, like Boots and Shoes, the George Best story, The History of Troubles according to my dad. But I mean, History of Troubles is probably the most successful play in Northern Ireland maybe ever. I'm talking like Donald Trump now, but in terms of box office, in terms of its done regularly and over and over and over and continuing to fill the Grand Opera House, it has an extraordinary lifespan.
Talk to me about Lynch's Corner.
I had nothing to do with it. There's a plaque on the wall of the John Hewitt Bar saying Lynch's Corner, and then a quote from one of the plays. It's from a guy out of Castles in the Air, Razorblade. Based on a wee man who used to drink in the club in Turf Lodge, who used to come walking over to me every half an hour when I'm sitting down to have a drink. And he'd be waving his arms about and he'd say, "Martin, if work was any good, the wealthy would be doing it." And I just, the way you just carry on talking, and then you hear that, you go, wow.
Whoa.
Else he'd come over and say, wee Martin, it's the banks. The banks. Sort out the banks. On the way back to his seat. But what was that about? What were we talking about there?
Well, let me ask you this then. If you could take anyone from Northern Ireland, dead or alive, out for a pint to Lynch's Corner and the John Hewitt, who would you take?
From Northern Ireland, dead or alive? Wow. John Hewitt himself would be a great one. Tommy Geehan, who ran the outdoor relief strike in 1932, would be another one. Betty Sinclair, who was 21-year-old leader of the outdoor release strike. These would be my heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Bucolic would be another one. I would love to sit down and talk to Bucolic.
I mentioned the lions at the start. What was that true?
True, absolutely true. Our Seamus saw them.
Wow.
Walking along York Street, tied with two big ropes, two lions, sometimes one lion. And
teeth or no teeth? Because I've heard different versions of the story.
What's that?
Did they have teeth or no teeth? Because I've heard a few versions.
Oh, they had teeth. I was speaking to his granddaughter recently, who lives in Los Angeles. Would you believe it? And she says they all had teeth. The teeth were extracted. But they were generally older in their years.
Aye.
They didn't have a lot of fire in them. Like, for instance, my dad says there'd be boxing builds in the Ulster Hall or the York Rangers Club down in York Street. And the first fight would be Bucolic and the lion. So he'd strip to the waist and get into the ring and start wrestling the lion, but the lion wasn't interested. So he'd whack it in the ribs, and it'd do a big roar, "Ah!" and the crowd would roar and cheer. So you had to whack it in the ribs to get any life out of them. They weren't very ferocious or anything like that.
Man, you mentioned the 18-hour play. I think we could do an 18-hour podcast. There's so much to chat about. Just to kind of put some sort of a tail on it, I usually end with this. Bit of a cliche, but I just think if it's not broke, why fix it?
Yeah.
If you could go back in time, say to an 18-year-old version of yourself, none of this time travel nonsense. Don't give me the I don't want to do anything in case it makes the universe blow up or whatever. But if you had a couple of minutes of an 18-year-old Martin's time, what would you say to him?
I'd be saying, do it now, go for it now. I didn't get the confidence to really produce and take control of my work until I was in my mid-40s, and I regret that. I wished I had the confidence when I was 18 or 19 or even my mid-20s.
Unreal. Well, for everyone listening, whether it's live here now or later on the podcast, I want to say thank you so much for spending this time with myself and Martin. Really hope you enjoyed the time. I had an absolute blast. Really want to say thank you to the Out to Lunch Festival for making this possible and for inviting us to do this and for giving us a space to do it. And other than that, Martin, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure, and I hope it's the first of many chats, because there's plenty more I'd love to talk to you about.
Thank you very much, Matthew, but you've been a great Bomber Gascoigne.
Awesome. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day.